Welcome, believers. Welcome, you wonderfully weird people. Welcome to UFO Aliens and Weird Stuff. Today, we're going to be talking about the ghost of Tom Crocker. There are places in Britain where the past feels far away, and there are places where it feels as though the past never really left. Off the coast of South Devon sits a strange little island called Burgh Island. At first glance, it looks almost beautiful, enough to belong on a postcard. Golden sands, rocky coastlines, the open sea stretching towards the horizon. But when the tide comes in, the island becomes something else. The causeway disappears beneath the water, and for a few hours Burgh Island is cut off from the mainland, and sitting there beside the sea is one of Devon's oldest pubs. It's called the Pilchard Inn. Its history stretched back around 7 centuries, and that's the good thing about Britain. Devon is genuinely beautiful. Fishermen drank there, sailors passed through there, smugglers are said to have used it, and according to local legend, one of those smugglers never really left. His name was Tom Crocker, and every year around the middle of August it is said that he comes back. To understand the story of Tom Crocker, you have to understand Burgh Island, because this isn't simply an old pub in an old village. It is an island, and that matters. For centuries, the tides effectively controlled who could come and go. At low tide, the island could be reached across the sand, but when the sea returned, the connection to the mainland disappeared. The Pilchard Inn sits at the foot of the island, and its own history describes it as a place that originally served fishermen before becoming associated with smugglers and wreckers. And you can imagine why. A place like this would have attracted smugglers. An isolated island, a secluded coastline, caves, changing tides, and a pub where men could disappear into the darkness with a drink in their hands. It was almost perfect. And somewhere within the history, the name Tom Crocker appears. Now, very little can actually be established with certainty about Tom Crocker, and that is one of the most fascinating parts of the story. We know the name, we know the legend, and we know that local tradition associates him with smuggling around Burke Island. There is even a coastal cave known as Tom Crocker's Hole, a cave that can only be reached from the sea. But beyond those fragments, the historical records become strangely thin. One source describes Crocker as an Elizabethan smuggler. Another later account gives a completely different date and describes him as a young smuggler killed in the 18th century. And then there are the stories about how he died, because even the manner of his death isn't constant. Some versions say he was shot, others say he was hanged, and some accounts suggest that he was killed by rivals. But perhaps the most persistent version tells us that Tom Crocker's final moments took place outside the Pilchard Inn. Now imagine Burke Island centuries ago. There was no electric lights, no cars, no phones, no tourists. Sounds idealistic, doesn't it? Just the sound of the sea. Inside the Pilchard Inn, men drank and talked quietly. Outside, the darkness stretches across the island, and somewhere out there, authorities are looking for smugglers. Now, according to the most commonly repeated version of the story, Crocker found himself confronted outside the inn. Exactly what happened next depends on which version of the legend you believe, but the ending is always the same. Tom Crocker died. Now, one tradition says that he was shot by a customs or revenue officer. Another says he was killed by rivals. Another says he was hanged. Even the paranormal sources that record the legend acknowledge that the circumstances are somewhat uncertain. But then something strange happens to the story, because Tom Crocker's death is apparently not the end of it. According to local legend, Crocker's spirit remains connected to Burke Island, and there is a particular date attached to his return, the 13th of August. Now, the paranormal database records the haunting as a reoccurring manifestation on that date. The story says that Crocker returns to the Pilchard Inn and the surrounding island, a dead smuggler, returning to the place where his life ended. And perhaps there is a reason the legend has survived, because the stories surrounding the Pilchard Inn are limited to sightings of a ghost. There are reports of strange activity inside the pub, objects apparently moving, unexplained disturbances, and glasses allegedly found smashed on the floor overnight. One published account even quotes a barman describing reports of objects apparently levitating inside the inn. Now, are these supernatural events? We don't know. Sounds very much like they are, though, does it? The There are perfectly ordinary explanations for many strange things that happen in old buildings. Of course, of course there is. But imagine being the person responsible for closing the pub up at midnight. It certainly wouldn't be me, to be honest. You switch off all the lights. You check the rooms, like you do. You make sure the doors are all locked. And before you leave, you are supposedly meant to say good night to Tom, because according to legend, you don't want to upset him. But there is something else, something that takes the story away from the pub and into the darkness surrounding the island. Ghostly lights can be seen. The folklore of the area contains stories of strange lights appearing along the shoreline. They have been associated with phantom wreckers. Wreckers were figures from coastal folklore said to have used lights to yaw ships towards dangerous waters where the vessels could be wrecked and their cargo stolen. Whether real wreckers actually behaved in this way in every story is another question, but the legend survived. And around Burgh Island, people have reportedly seen strange lights moving along the shore. Imagine seeing one. You're standing outside the Pilchard Inn. The pub is behind you. The sea is somewhere in front of you. There is almost no light. Then a small glow appears. Far down the beach. A lantern, possibly. That at least that's what it looks like. It moves slowly, then disappears. Phantom lights. A few moments later, another light appears further along the coast. Perhaps it's someone walking. Perhaps it's a boat. Perhaps it's simply a distant light distorted by darkness and sea mist. Or perhaps, as the stories claim, it's one of those phantom wreckers returning to the shoreline. And then we come to another part of Burgh Island's history, the smugglers. The Pilchard Inn was perfectly positioned for people who didn't want their activities noticed. There are stories of secret routes and hidden places connected with the island. Tom Crocker's name survives in the name of the cave known as Tom Crocker's Hole, and the smugglers' traditions surrounding Burgh Island are well established in local historical accounts. The strange thing is that we don't have a complete story. We have fragments. We have a cave. We have an old inn. We have a smuggler's name. There are stories of contraband, stories of violence, stories of hidden treasure. But then, of course, you've got a ghost. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. Perhaps this is how the legends are born. A real person becomes a story. The story becomes a legend, and eventually, this is what I like the most, the legend becomes something people believe they have seen. There is something particularly unsettling about haunted pubs. There is loads in Britain because pubs are normally places full of noise. That's why they're haunted. Conversation, laughter, music, glasses hitting wooden tables. But imagine the same room after closing time. The chairs are empty. The fires have gone. The last customer has crossed the island. And outside, the tide is coming in. Because don't forget, you're going to get trapped. The sea gradually surrounds Burgh Island. The mainland disappears into the darkness. The pub is now sitting alone on an island. And somewhere inside that ancient building, according to the stories, Tom Crocker may still be there. Perhaps that's why the old tradition says to say good night to him. Not because anyone can prove that a ghost is standing in the shadows, but because after centuries of stories, perhaps nobody really wants to take the chance. And this is where the story becomes more interesting, because we have to separate the legend from the history. There is no reliable evidence proving that Tom Crocker's ghost walks the Pilchard Inn. There is no scientific evidence proving that objects inside the pub are moved by a supernatural force. And the stories about his death are inconsistent. Even historical accounts acknowledge that surprisingly little is known about Crocker himself. So perhaps there was a real smuggler called Tom Crocker. Perhaps he really did operate around Burgh Island. And perhaps he really was killed outside the inn. And perhaps even after hundreds of years, his story becomes embellished. A shooting becomes a haunting. A cave became a hiding place for treasure. Strange noises become footsteps. Broken glasses become the work of a ghost. And mysterious lights become phantom records. That explanation is entirely plausible, but there is another possibility, and that is where we leave history behind and enter the questions that remain. Why does the legend of Tom Crocker refuse to die? Why this island? Why this pub? Why the recurring date in August? And why do stories of strange activity continue to surround a building that has stood here for almost 700 years? Perhaps there is nothing supernatural about Burke Island at all. Perhaps the combination of wind, waves, darkness, an ancient building, and centuries of storytelling has created the perfect environment for ghost stories. Or perhaps there are places where history leaves something behind, something that doesn't appear in books, something that waits. And if the legend is true, then someone around the middle of August, when the tide surrounds Burke Island and the last lights disappear from the mainland, Tom Crocker returns. Maybe he walks through the old rooms of the Pilchard Inn. Maybe he stands outside the doorway where he supposedly died. Maybe he searches the shoreline for something he's never found, possibly his treasure, possibly revenge, or simply his way home. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is that the story says he comes back every year. Not every 100 years, not once in a generation, every single year. The same island, the same pub, possibly because he was shot there, the same ghost, and the same date. And that's where legends are built from. So if you ever find yourself on Burke Island and the tide is coming in and night is beginning to fall, take one last look towards the shoreline. Because if you see a light moving through the darkness, don't automatically assume it's a lantern. And if you're the last person inside the Pilchard Inn, before you leave, you might just want to say goodbye to Tom, just in case. Well, look, this is UFO, aliens, and weird stuff. Remember, sometimes the strangest stories aren't found in distant galaxies. Sometimes they're waiting in the oldest pub on a tiny little island off the coast of Devon. Well, thank you very much. This was UFO, aliens, and weird stuff. Really appreciate you sticking around. Please like, subscribe, and ding that notification bell. And I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you.